There's a moment in every man's life when the door he's been pushing against, the one he'd hoped would open, slams shut in his face. Not just a gentle click, but a final, echoing thud that shakes the ground he stands on. It ain't just the sound, it's the quiet that follows. The kind of quiet that fills a room and settles deep in your bones, telling you in no uncertain terms, no. It's a bitter taste, that no. It tells a man he wasn't good enough, or smart enough, or maybe just plain lucky enough. And for most folks, that's where the story ends. They turn around, shoulders slumped, and find another path, often a smaller, safer one, or sometimes they just stop walking altogether. They park their truck right there and never turn the key again. But then there are others, rare few, the ones who hear that no, and instead of feeling the end, they feel a spark, a shift. They don't just walk away. They stop, they listen to the echo, and they ask themselves, why? That's where Clayton comes in. 47 years old, a man whose life had been measured in the rhythmic clank and whir of the factory floor, the steady hum of machines that never stopped. He worked the night shift mostly, sometimes the day, depending on what needed doing, what hole needed plugging. A shift man, you might say, shifting his life around the demands of the plant, around the needs of his family. You'd walk past Clayton on the street, or even in the break room, and you might not notice him. He was that kind of man, blended in like the worn gray of the concrete floor he spent his life on. But if you took a second, truly looked, you'd see a story etched into him, deep as the grain in an old oak. His face was a map of it. Lines around his eyes weren't from smiling much, but from squinting through safety glasses at sparks flying off the grinding wheel, or from the strain of 1,000 early mornings. His jaw was set always, a quiet resolve, the kind you see in men who carry heavy loads without complaint. And a 5 o'clock shadow seemed to sprout on his chin by noon, stubbornly asserting itself, a small defiance in a life of conformity. His hands, though, his hands told the real tale. Knobby and scarred, the nails permanently rimmed with a fine layer of oil and grime that no soap, no amount of scrubbing could ever truly erase. They were the hands of a working man, yes, but more than that, they were the hands of a maker, a fixer, a doer. Calluses like tough leather on his palms, each one a monument to a bolt tightened, a lever pulled, a heavy piece of metal guided into place. They were broad, strong hands, but not rough. You could see the care in how he handled a small tool, the almost gentle precision. They moved with a practiced economy, no wasted effort, every motion honed by years of repetition. They held the weight of his work, but also you could sense the weight of his worries. His eyes, deep set beneath a brow often furrowed in thought, were tired. Not just didn't get enough sleep last night tired, but years of carrying too much tired. Yet there was a spark in them, too. A quiet observation, a flicker of something still alive, still hopeful, even if it rarely broke through the stoic surface he presented to the world. He moved with a steady gait, broad shoulders slightly rounded from leaning over machines, but there was a coiled strength to him, like an old spring that might still snap back with surprising force if pushed hard enough. His work boots were scuffed. His blue work shirt faded, stained in places only he'd notice, and his jeans had seen more days than they cared to remember. He was a man built for endurance, for weathering storms, for just getting through the day. He looked like the backbone of the world, unassuming, quiet, carrying the burden of his life with an almost invisible strength. He was Clayton, and he was about to learn a different way to walk. His life, a rhythm hammered out on the anvil of responsibility, began before the first hint of dawn. The alarm on his worn nightstand, a relic of a simpler time, sang its tinny tune at 5 o'clock sharp every single weekday. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. It was a precise, unyielding start to a day that rarely deviated. He'd swing his legs off the bed, the familiar creak of the springs a quiet companion in the pre-dawn hush, and find his way to the kitchen for the ritual of coffee. The rich, dark brew, strong enough to kickstart a sleepy engine, was his silent confidant as he watched the sky outside the window slowly lighten from inky black to bruised purple, then a pale, hopeful gray. Sarah, his wife, would often be stirring by then, sometimes joining him for a quiet moment, a shared glance that spoke volumes about the grind they both understood. Emily, 16, and Michael, 12, would be deep in their teenage and preteen dreams, blissfully unaware of the silent battle their father fought each morning just to get out the door. After a quick, usually cold, breakfast grabbed on the go, he'd pull on his heavy work jacket, the faint scent of machine oil and metal clinging to its fabric, and head out. The drive to the factory was always the same. The same cracks in the pavement, the same half-frozen puddles in winter, the same stretch of highway where the sun always seemed to hit his eyes just right, forcing him to squint. He'd park in his usual spot, walk through the same gate, nod to the same security guard, and step into the controlled chaos of the plant. The clang and hum, the roar of machinery, the sharp tang of coolant and ozone, it was the soundtrack to his existence. He worked on the assembly line, a master of one particular intricate part of the process, his hands moving with an almost balletic grace born of 25 years of repetition. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year. It paid the bills, it kept the lights on, and it put food on the table. It was simply what he did. Lunch breaks were short, usually spent alone with a thermos and a sandwich, not because he was unfriendly, but because the quiet offered a reprieve from the relentless noise. He'd sit on a bench, watching the younger guys joke around, and sometimes a wave of weariness would wash over him, heavier than any steel beam he'd ever lifted. He'd think about the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the mortgage, Emily's braces, Michael's new school shoes, the seemingly endless cycle of expenses that kept his family afloat but him firmly anchored to this predictable, demanding life. He wasn't complaining, not really. He was grateful for the work, for the security it offered. But deep down, in the quiet corners of his mind, a different kind of calculation was always running. That hidden calculation was the true weight he carried. It wasn't the physical labor that rounded his shoulders so much as the buried dreams. He'd always had a knack for how things fit together, how systems could be improved. In high school, he'd tinkered with engines, even drew up designs for contraptions that seemed outlandish back then but made perfect sense in his head. There was a time, long ago, when he'd dreamed of being an engineer, of designing things that actually worked, that made a difference. But life, as it often does, had steered him down a different path. Bills came, family came, and the practical path seemed the only responsible one. Every time he'd glimpsed an opportunity to step outside that path, a suggestion he made in a meeting that was politely ignored, a promotion he felt qualified for that went to someone else, a night class he considered but never signed up for, a familiar ache would settle in his chest. He'd interpret those missed chances, those quiet rejections, as a sign that he wasn't smart enough, not articulate enough, not good enough. He'd internalize it, the sting a slow burn that reinforced his reluctance to try again, to stick his neck out and risk looking foolish. Better to stay quiet, dependable, a cog in the machine. Less painful that way. His greatest fear wasn't failing, but failing visibly, confirming to himself and, God forbid, to Sarah and the kids, that his quiet aspirations were nothing more than pipe dreams. He wanted a better future for his children, a future where they weren't limited by the same fears he was. And yet he saw himself mirroring those very limitations, a silent example of what not to be. But then came the idea. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a solution, a genuine improvement for the production process that had been bugging him for months. He'd seen the inefficiencies, the wasted material, the bottlenecks that slowed everything down. He'd spent his evenings after the kids were asleep, hunched over the kitchen table, sketching diagrams on greasy paper napkins, filling notebooks with calculations, testing theories in his head. He talked about it tentatively with Sarah, her steady encouragement a soft wind beneath his wings. This wasn't just some vague notion. This was concrete, practical, and he knew with a certainty that hummed in his bones it would work. He polished his proposal, detailing the cost savings, the increased output, the ease of implementation. He saw it as more than just an idea. He saw it as a lifeline, not just for the factory, but for a piece of himself he thought he'd lost. A chance to prove, quietly, maybe just to himself, that he was more than just a pair of hands. He imagined the pride in Emily and Michael's eyes, even if he didn't explain all the technical details, just the fact that their dad had made a difference. He finally worked up the courage to submit it, a simple email to his supervisor, feeling a rare, nervous tremor of hope that was almost exhilarating. Days turned into a week, then 2. He waited, a tightness in his gut, a flicker of that old ambition burning brighter than it had in years. Finally, a response landed in his inbox. It was short, to the point, and utterly dismissive. "Thank you for your submission, Clayton. We've reviewed your proposal. We've decided to stick with our current procedures at this time." No explanation, no offer to discuss, just a cold, corporate brush-off. The words hung there, digital and stark, on the screen. "We've decided to stick with our current procedures at this time." Clayton read it again, then a third time, as if the meaning might shift, might soften, might offer a hidden clause he'd missed. But it didn't. It was a brick wall, cold and unyielding, slammed down in front of a hope he hadn't realized he'd let grow so tall. The exhilarating tremor from weeks ago turned into a tremor of something else entirely, a dull ache that spread through his chest, settling deep in his stomach. It wasn't just the idea that was dismissed. It felt like a dismissal of him, of his effort, his insight, his quiet belief that he could make things better. The light that had flickered for weeks, that silent, stubborn flame of ambition, snuffed out with a single click. He clicked out of the email, the screen going dark, mirroring the sudden dimness in his own world. The kitchen table, usually a place of blueprints and whispered dreams, now just held the ghosts of ambition. He sat there in the quiet, the house breathing around him, Sarah and the kids sound asleep. He should probably clear away the last of the scattered papers, the pen he'd used for late-night calculations, but he couldn't move. The old, familiar weight settled on his shoulders, a weight he'd carried for years, a weight forged from 100 smaller rejections, 100 small dreams that had never quite taken flight. When the alarm clock blared at 5:00 a.m. the next morning, its insistent beep felt less like a call to action and more like a cruel reminder. Another day exactly like the last and the one before that. He slapped the snooze button with a weary hand, the knuckles scarred and thick, evidence of decades spent wrestling with metal and machinery. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar creak of the springs a testament to routine. In the bathroom, the mirror reflected a man who looked his 47 years and then some. The lines around his eyes were deeper than he remembered, etched not just by time, but by the strain of always pushing, always just making do. His hair, once dark brown, was flecked with gray at the temples, a silver badge of quiet endurance. The factory hummed to life with the dawn, just as Clayton did. The smell of oil and hot metal was his cologne. The rhythmic clanking of the presses, the whine of the conveyor belts, the occasional shout over the din, this was the soundtrack of his life. He moved with practiced efficiency, a cog in a much larger machine, performing the same motions day in and day out. His hands knew the work intimately, his body moved through the motions on autopilot, leaving his mind free to wander, or more often, to stew. His world was a landscape of careful budgeting. Every dollar stretched, every choice weighed against another. Groceries, school supplies, the ever-looming specter of the utility bills that seemed to creep higher with every season. He knew the price of a gallon of milk, the cost of new shoes for Michael, the anxiety of Emily's upcoming college applications, and how thin the margin was between making it and falling behind. He'd seen friends lose their jobs, seen families crack under the strain. He wasn't complaining, not really. He was a survivor, a provider. He had a roof over his head, food on the table, a loving family. But the fight to keep it all steady year after year slowly siphoned away a little more of his internal fuel. What haunted him most wasn't the poverty, but the quiet erosion of his spirit. He remembered a younger Clayton, a kid with wild ideas and a restless energy, full of plans. He wanted to build things, invent things, leave a mark. Now those dreams felt buried under layers of metal dust and missed opportunities. They were like fossils, faint outlines of what might have been. He'd never truly allowed himself to regret to wallow, but sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and the world outside was dark, he'd feel a bitter pang. The gap between the man he was and the man he'd once fiercely hoped to be felt immense, a chasm he'd somehow fallen into without noticing. He often saw the spark of ambition in his own children, Emily's drive to learn, Michael's endless curiosity, and it both filled him with pride and twisted a knot in his gut. He wanted them to have more, to be more than he was. He didn't want them to inherit his caution, his fear of stepping out, his tendency to internalize every setback as a personal failing. The factory had a way of wearing you down, not just your body, but your will. It taught you to follow orders, to keep your head down, to not rock the boat. And after years of having his own ideas ignored, his suggestions brushed aside, his quiet efforts going unnoticed, he'd learned that lesson perhaps too well. He'd become the dependable, stoic Clayton, the man who showed up, did his job, and kept his opinions to himself. The surprising ambition that had briefly flared with his production process idea now felt like a foolish, naive thing, a small ember that had dared to glow too brightly in the cold, corporate air, only to be extinguished and leave behind nothing but ash. The idea he'd poured his heart into wasn't some half-baked notion jotted on a napkin during a lunch break. This was different. He'd spent months, quiet evenings at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, sketching out flowcharts, calculating efficiency gains on old receipts. He'd talked to guys on the line, got their input, tweaked it. It was a simpler way to reroute components, cutting down on wasted motion and bottlenecks he saw every single day. He could feel it would work. He had even practiced explaining it to Sarah, distilling complex factory jargon into something she could understand, trying to anticipate questions to make it airtight. He'd allowed himself, for a fleeting time, to believe. When he finally submitted it, a neat stack of papers with his careful handwriting, he felt a flicker of that old ambition. It wasn't about a promotion, not really. It was about making things better, about leaving a mark, about proving to himself that he still had ideas worth listening to. He walked into Mr. Henderson's office, the plant manager, a man whose face rarely broke from a perpetual frown with a hopeful knot in his stomach. Henderson listened, or rather, he tolerated Clayton's explanation, his eyes already drifting to the stack of invoices on his desk. "Interesting, Clayton." Henderson had grunted, picking up the proposal and flipping through it with a dismissive air, barely scanning the pages Clayton had agonized over. He set it down with a soft thud. "We appreciate the initiative, but we're happy with the current process. It's established. No need to complicate things. No need to complicate things." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. No explanation of why it was bad, no offer to look closer, no constructive criticism. Just a blunt dismissal, a polite way of saying, "Stay in your lane, Clayton. You just turn the wrench." It was the same brick wall he'd hit a dozen times before, but this time it felt heavier, colder. He felt the blood drain from his face, a familiar hot flush of shame creeping up his neck. He mumbled a quiet, "Understood," and left, the hope draining out of him like sand through his fingers. He got home that evening, the weight of the rejection pressing down on him, heavier than any load he lifted at the factory. Emily was talking about a science project. Michael was showing off a drawing. Sarah asked about his day, and the words just wouldn't come out right. He tried to explain, tried to downplay it, but Emily, sharp as a tack, saw past his stoicism. "So they didn't even try it, Dad?" she asked, her brow furrowed, a flicker of disappointment in her eyes that mirrored his own. Michael, ever innocent, piped up, "But Dad, it sounded like such a good idea." That was it. That was the crack, seeing the belief in their faces, then watching it dim because he had failed to convince he had been shot down again. It wasn't just his own crushed ambition anymore. It was the reflection of their innocent faith in him that hurt most. He had wanted to show them that persistence paid off, that good ideas mattered, that you could make a difference. Instead, he'd just proven to them that sometimes the world just says no, and you're supposed to just take it. A fierce, unfamiliar heat started to burn within him, not of anger, but of a quiet, stubborn refusal. This time it wouldn't just break him. This time it would fuel him. He woke at 3 in the morning, the house utterly silent save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The clock digits glowed a sickly green. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, the dark pressing in, the words, "No need to complicate things," echoing in the empty space of his mind. Sarah was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. He didn't want to wake her, didn't want to burden her with the turmoil churning inside him. He slipped out of bed, the old floorboards creaking a protest beneath his feet, and made his way to the kitchen, stopping only to grab a glass of water, then settling into his worn armchair in the living room. The night outside was black, starless. He felt a chill, not from the cold, but from something deeper. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from his own thoughts. What had his life become? 47 years old, a factory worker, dependable, stoic. He'd done what was expected. Married Sarah, had 2 good kids, paid the bills, kept the house tidy, never caused trouble. But was that it? Was that the sum total of Clayton Miller? A wave of bitter honesty washed over him. He was tired. Not just bone tired from the double shift he'd pulled last week, but soul tired. He was afraid, afraid of trying, afraid of failing, afraid of looking foolish. He'd retreated into himself so many times, accepted the no as a definitive judgment on him, on his intelligence, his worth. He'd told himself it was easier, safer to just keep his head down. But what had that gotten him? A quiet life, sure, but also a quiet despair. A deep ache of unfulfilled potential. He pictured his kids' faces again, their fleeting disappointment, and it was a mirror. They didn't just see a dad who failed to get his idea heard. They saw a dad who stopped trying once he was told no. That was the bitter truth he couldn't escape in the dark. He had given up on himself so many times, convinced himself that no meant you can't, instead of not yet or not this way. He'd allowed the world to define his limits, and in doing so, he'd limited his own children's view of what was possible. The silence of the house pressed down, heavier than any machinery in the factory. He closed his eyes, the sting of unshed tears pricking at them. This couldn't be all there was. This quiet surrender, this internalizing of every setback until it became a part of his very identity, had to stop. This quiet surrender, this internalizing of every setback until it became a part of his very identity, had to stop. The word formed in his mind, quiet as a falling snowflake in the dark, yet solid as the concrete floor of the factory. Enough. It wasn't a roar or even a frustrated sigh. It was a deep, unshakable conviction that settled in the pit of his stomach. Enough of letting the no become never. Enough of shrinking, of accepting less than what he knew he was capable of, not just for himself, but for the silent message it sent his kids. He didn't know what would happen next, or how he'd even begin to chip away at decades of ingrained habit, but he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that this particular chapter of quiet resignation was closed. He had to try. He had to try differently. The thought brought a strange, unfamiliar warmth to his chest, pushing back against the chill of the early morning. The alarm shrilled at 4:45 a.m., a metallic jab back into the world. Clayton swung his legs out of bed, the familiar ache in his lower back a constant companion. The internal fire from the dark hours before felt distant, almost like a dream. The pull to simply go through the motions, to let the factory floor swallow him whole, was powerful. He walked past the kitchen table, where the crumpled napkin with his production process idea still lay, a monument to his recent defeat. His gaze snagged on it, and for a split second the old habit, the old defeatism, clawed at him. "Just leave it, Clay. It's done." They said no. The voice in his head was a familiar, comforting whisper of retreat. He poured his coffee, the strong, black liquid, a ritualistic start to another day. Sarah stirred awake as he moved around, a rustle of blankets from the bedroom. He felt the weight of her unspoken trust, the kids' innocent expectation. And then he remembered the deep sting of disappointment he'd seen in their eyes, the reflection of his own surrender. That whisper from 3 a.m., "This can't be all there is," came back louder now, cutting through the haze of morning inertia. He picked up the napkin. His calloused fingers smoothed out the wrinkles, flattening the crude diagrams and scribbled notes. He didn't toss it in the trash. He didn't even put it back on the table. Instead, he carried it with him to his worn armchair by the window, where the first faint hint of dawn was bleeding into the sky. He sat down, his coffee mug steaming in one hand, the napkin in the other. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore it, to forget about it, to protect himself from another sting. But the quiet defiance of his earlier decision held firm. He looked at his drawings, not through the lens of failure, but with a new, grudging curiosity. Why did they say no? It wasn't a rhetorical question this time, born of self-pity. It was a genuine inquiry. He started tracing lines, tapping his finger against a flow chart. Was it the cost? The implementation time? Was there something he missed in the factory's current setup? He saw the faces of the managers in his mind's eye, their blank stares, the curt dismissal. He didn't have answers, not yet, but he wasn't burying the idea. He wasn't letting the no be the final word. This was new. This was the first quiet pushback against years of ingrained surrender. It felt small, almost insignificant, but in that moment for Clayton it felt like moving a mountain. He didn't realize it then, but he had just taken the first shaky step on a different path, away from what had always been and towards what could be. He was asking why instead of just accepting what. And that, for him, was everything. The next morning, the factory floor hummed with its usual mechanical symphony. A familiar rhythm that had once been comforting, now felt like a relentless drumbeat reminding him of his place. Clayton tried to look at his work with fresh eyes, to see potential inefficiencies, but the noise, the repetition, the sheer physical demand of the job quickly wore down that fragile new perspective. He caught himself more than once just going through the motions, his mind drifting back to the crumpled napkin, the rejected idea. The managers he had thought of approaching yesterday now seemed unapproachable, distant figures behind glass walls. What would he even say? "Excuse me, could you tell me why you thought my idea for making your life easier was rubbish?" The words tasted bitter even in his own head. He tried, though. He cornered Frank, a supervisor he'd known for 20 years, during a coffee break. Frank was a good man, but he lived by the book. "Hey, Frank," Clayton started, trying to sound casual. "Remember that production process idea I put forward last week?" Frank grunted, stirring his instant coffee. "Yeah, Clay," the big wigs shot it down. "Did they say why exactly?" Clayton pressed, his voice a little softer than he intended. Frank shrugged, took a long sip. "Said it wasn't feasible, too much disruption. You know how it is, always looking for the next big thing, then sticking to the way it's always been." He offered a sympathetic but final glance. "Don't sweat it, Clay, happens all the time." That was it. Don't sweat it. The old familiar phrase, a pat on the back that felt more like a push back into line. Clayton felt the familiar cold dread settling in his stomach, the urge to just drop it, to accept the verdict. "See, I told you so. Waste of time." The internal voice was loud, practiced, and persuasive. He managed to keep that napkin tucked away, though. It became a quiet rebellion. He'd pull it out late at night after Sarah and the kids were asleep, tracing the lines, adding new questions. If it's too much disruption, what's a smaller change that could achieve part of the goal? If it's cost, where can I cut? It wasn't progress, not in the traditional sense, but it was engagement. It was still moving, however, slowly in the face of the overwhelming urge to stop. By the end of the first week, the initial spark felt like it was dying under a pile of responsibilities. Emily needed help with a history project. Michael's soccer cleats had given up the ghost. The old water heater in the basement started making ominous gurgling noises. Every new demand felt like another drain on his already finite energy, another reason to abandon the foolish notion of rethinking a rejected idea. He was tired, bone-tired. The quiet moments he carved out were no longer filled with hopeful curiosity, but with a gnawing frustration. He'd find himself staring at the napkin, not seeing solutions, but seeing only the impenetrable wall of corporate indifference, the unyielding truth of, it wasn't feasible. The fear of looking foolish, of having tried and failed again, clawed at him. One particularly grueling Tuesday, after working an unexpected double shift, he got home close to midnight. Sarah was asleep, the house quiet. He pulled out the napkin, and for the first time since that dawn conversation with himself, he felt a wave of pure, unadulterated defeat wash over him. He wanted to crumple it up, truly crumple it this time, and toss it in the bin, along with every lingering trace of ambition that still clung to his weary soul. "What's the point?" he muttered into the silent kitchen. "They don't care. No one cares." He saw the faces of Emily and Michael in his mind, their innocent belief that their dad could fix anything, solve anything. And then the memory of their quiet disappointment when he told them he'd just have to stick with what he knew after the last idea got shot down. That memory, like a cold splash of water, startled him. It wasn't about the managers. It wasn't about their approval. It was about his response. It was about what he was teaching his kids, not with words, but with his actions. Was he going to show them that when things got hard, when someone said no, you just folded? Was that the lesson? He didn't pick up the pen that night. He didn't even look at the diagrams. He just sat there, the crumpled napkin now lying flat, carefully smoothed by his rough hands. But he didn't throw it away. The fight was still in him, simmering, not burning bright, but a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. He was exhausted, yes, but also stubbornly still present. He hadn't given up, not yet. He still had more. Why? Questions to ask himself, more corners of his own fear to navigate. The battle wasn't won, but the war wasn't lost either. It was a messy internal brawl fought in the silent hours of the night, fueled by a promise he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. He just knew deep down that this time, no, couldn't be the final word. The crumpled napkin still lay on the kitchen table when Sarah came down for work a few hours later. She saw it, then glanced at the empty chair where Clayton usually sat. A familiar ache settled in her chest. She knew that look, that quiet resignation. But when Clayton came home that evening, something was different. Not a grand change, not a sudden burst of energy, but a subtle shift in the air around him. He still looked tired, his shoulders still carried the day's weight, but the light in his eyes, while still dim, held a flicker of something new. A resolve, a question maybe. He went back to work the next day with the napkin in his pocket. For almost a week, he watched the production line with new eyes, not just doing his job, but observing, calculating, listening. He tried to see his idea from the manager's perspective, from the accountant's, even from the guy on the next shift who'd have to implement it. What were their concerns? What did they stand to lose? Then, during a scheduled break, he approached Mr. Henderson, the supervisor who dismissed his idea. "Mr. Henderson," Clayton started, his voice steady, not accusatory, "about that new process I pitched last month. I understand it didn't make the cut, and I respect that. But I'd be grateful if you could tell me specifically what were the main concerns. Was it the upfront cost, the downtime, or something else?" Henderson, surprised by the calm, almost clinical tone, leaned back in his chair. He'd expected an argument or another defeated grunt. "Well, Clayton, honestly, the numbers just didn't pencil out. Too much disruption for too little gain in our estimation. And the capital expenditure," he trailed off, explaining more than he had the first time. Clayton listened, his eyes unblinking, occasionally nodding slowly. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue. He just absorbed the information, asking clarifying questions where necessary. So if the downtime could be minimized, he suggested, and the initial outlay spread out, would that change the calculation? Henderson just shrugged, but the seed was planted. Clayton left that office not defeated but armed. He had specifics now. He had the why. He took those reasons, those objections, and he went back to the drawing board. The napkin stayed on the table, but now it was surrounded by new sketches, fresh calculations, revised flowcharts. He spent evenings poring over books from the public library on lean manufacturing and process efficiency. He even downloaded some open-source software to model his ideas, squinting at the small laptop screen. Sarah saw it. He wasn't just retreating into himself. He was working. He wasn't complaining about the no, he was dissecting it. Sometimes he'd mutter to himself, "Too much disruption, huh? All right, how do we make it less disruptive?" Or capital expenditure, what if we phased it in piece by piece? The frustration was still there, a constant hum, but now it was a fuel, not a brake. He was treating the rejection like a tough puzzle, not a brick wall. A few weeks later, a faint buzz started on the factory floor. Old man Peterson, who'd worked alongside Clayton for 30 years, caught him one morning. "Heard you were talking to Henderson again, Clay. You still pushing that idea of yours?" Clayton nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Just trying to understand the angles, Frank." Peterson just grunted, but he watched Clayton differently now. The quiet man wasn't just taking orders anymore, he was asking questions. Clayton didn't go back to Henderson with the same idea. He went to a lower-level supervisor, a younger guy named Mark, who was always looking for ways to impress management. He presented a modified version of his process, broken into 3 distinct, smaller phases, each with minimal disruption and lower initial costs. He had done his homework. He had answers for Mark's inevitable objections before Mark even voiced them. He'd learned to anticipate the no and build his response right into the presentation. Mark, intrigued by the sheer detail and the thoughtful solutions to the prior objections, didn't give him an immediate yes. But he didn't give him a blunt no either. He gave him something better. "Clayton, this looks feasible. I can't greenlight the whole thing, but I can probably get you approval for a small pilot program on your section of the line just to test out phase 1. No promises after that, but it's a start." A start. It wasn't the whole enchilada, but it was a crack in the wall. Clayton felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. He walked out of Mark's office, not running, not shouting, but with a quiet, satisfied hum in his chest. He wasn't the same man who'd walked in there a month ago. He was still Clayton, the steady factory worker, but the fear of looking foolish, the sting of past rejections, they didn't hold him captive anymore. He started setting up the pilot program in his section. Emily and Michael would come out to the garage some evenings, watching him tinker with components he'd salvaged, explaining his refined process. "See, guys," he'd say, pointing to a diagram, "Mr. Henderson said it caused too much downtime. So instead of shutting down the whole line, we're just gonna reroute this one part quick and clean during the shift change." They didn't understand all the mechanics, but they understood the spirit. They saw their dad not giving up, but finding a different way. One evening, sitting across from Sarah at the kitchen table, the one scrumpled napkin now a blueprint, he finally articulated the truth that had slowly settled in his bones. "You know," he said, looking at her, a genuine smile creasing his tired face, "most folks, when they get told no, they hear you ain't good enough. I used to be one of them. Every time it felt like a verdict on me." He paused, tracing a line on the napkin. "But a no ain't the end of the road, Sarah. It's just a signpost. Sometimes it means try harder, sometimes try smarter, sometimes try a different road altogether. It ain't about stopping, it's about figuring out where to go next." He looked up, his eyes holding a depth she hadn't seen in years. "What matters is you don't park your truck and give up. You learn from it, dust yourself off, and keep on driving.